In the years following the Revolutionary War, the newly independent United States looked nothing like a single nation. Instead, 13 distinct state governments were operating entirely on their own, issuing separate currencies, heavily taxing each other's goods, and violently squabbling over borders. The economic situation quickly spiraled into mass foreclosures and bankruptcies. By the fall of 1786, unpaid Revolutionary War veterans in Massachusetts took up arms. Led by Daniel Shays, a rebellion of over 1,000 men marched on state armories and shut down the courts, proving the local militias could barely keep order within their own borders. This printed document is the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union. It was the country's first legal framework, and it intentionally created a central government so weak that it could not levy taxes, raise a standing army, or mediate the growing disputes between the states. Looming over this immediate chaos was an impossible divide. The northern states were rapidly industrializing into economies based on wage labor and manufacturing, while the southern states relied entirely on agricultural wealth generated by the brutal system of chattel slavery. To prevent the young republic from shattering into a dozen vulnerable pieces, the founders chose to negotiate. Rather than solving their moral contradictions, they built a fragile, continuous architecture of political deals that would hold the country together just a little longer. The first major deal was struck in Philadelphia during the summer of 1787. Realizing the Articles of Confederation had failed, delegates drafted an entirely new constitution, establishing a powerful central government divided into 3 branches, executive, legislative, and judicial, to balance power and prevent tyranny. But to get the southern states to ratify this new system, northern delegates agreed to leave the institution of slavery intact. They deliberately postponed any federal resolution on the issue, choosing a unified government over universal liberty. This map illustrates the sheer scale of the nation's next test. The massive yellow area in the center is the Louisiana Purchase of 1803. In a single transaction with France, the United States doubled its size, fueling a belief in manifest destiny, the idea that Americans were meant to spread across the entire continent. As settlers moved into these newly acquired lands, they carried the country's original contradiction with them. Every time a territory spanning toward the Pacific applied for statehood, a fierce political battle erupted over whether that new land would be incorporated as free or slave states. To keep the peace, Congress passed the Missouri Compromise in 1820. This legislative deal drew a physical line across the map. It admitted Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state, explicitly maintaining a strict mathematical tie between free and slave states. That fragile mathematics held for nearly 3 decades, until the United States captured over 1 million square miles of land following the Mexican-American War in 1848. The acquisition of places like California and New Mexico destroyed the neat geographic boundaries the government had relied on to keep the peace. In 1854, desperate to avoid another gridlock, politicians introduced popular sovereignty for the new Kansas and Nebraska territories. Instead of Washington deciding, the local settlers would vote on whether to allow slavery. Thousands of settlers rushed across the borders to skew the demographic numbers. Pro- and anti-slavery factions quickly abandoned the ballot box and began hacking each other to death with broadswords in the streets. The resulting territorial warfare, known as Bleeding Kansas, left hundreds dead as ideologues fought for physical control of the new state. The violence escalated in 1859 when radical abolitionist John Brown led an armed raid on the federal armory at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. He intended to arm enslaved people and ignite a rebellion, proving that political negotiation had given way to outright warfare. The final breaking point arrived the following year, with the 1860 presidential election. The Republican candidate, Abraham Lincoln, ran on a platform strongly opposing the expansion of slavery into any new territories. Upon his victory, Southern leaders saw the writing on the wall. They recognized that Lincoln's election meant the era of federal appeasement was over, and the gradual dismantling of their slave-based economy was inevitable. In December of 1860, South Carolina formally seceded, followed shortly by the rest of the Deep South. The political architecture of compromise had collapsed. Force was now the only remaining mechanism to resolve the nation's core contradiction. The ensuing civil war tore the country apart, leveling southern cities and reducing infrastructure to brick ruins and surviving columns. It took 4 grinding years of combat and over 600,000 American casualties for the Union Army to finally crush the rebellion and force the fractured nation back together. Following the Confederate surrender in 1865, the federal government immediately pivoted to a massive reform effort known as Reconstruction. Congress passed the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, officially abolishing slavery, guaranteeing equal protection, and granting voting rights regardless of race. To enforce these new laws, the South was divided into military districts. For the first time, armed, uniformed African American soldiers, backed by the full weight of the federal government, actively protected the voting access and lives of newly freed Black citizens. This period represented the very first time the United States prioritized human rights enforcement over political appeasement. But that commitment was short-lived. Just a decade after the Civil War ended, the heavily contested presidential election of 1876 resulted in an electoral deadlock, threatening to throw the exhausted country back into civil conflict. To secure the presidency for Northern Republican Rutherford B. Hayes, politicians struck one last bargain, the Compromise of 1877. In exchange for the White House, the federal government agreed to withdraw all federal troops from the southern states. Without military enforcement, Reconstruction immediately collapsed. The federal government gave up on its promise to protect free Black citizens, allowing local authorities to quickly implement the oppressive, violent system of disenfranchisement known as Jim Crow. The United States survived its volatile first century by relying on a relentless willingness to make political deals. But those compromises did not peacefully resolve the country's deepest flaws. They merely delayed them, purchasing national unity by sacrificing the rights, freedom, and lives of its most vulnerable people.